Welcome to the Beyond the Horizons podcast, where we delve into and expand upon some of the key issues raised in the Enable 2024 MSP Horizons report, produced in conjunction with Canalys. In this episode, Troels Rasmussen, General Manager of Security at Enable, looks at the key security technologies MSPs need to be investing in, as well as the important role they play in helping to create more resilient businesses. Welcome to another episode of Beyond the Horizons podcast. This time I'm joined by Troels Rasmussen, our MD of Security. Thanks for joining me, Troels.
Thanks, Pete. Thanks for having me. Excited to debate with you.
So, as with all these podcasts, I like to kind of put a little bit of positioning in at the start, which is kind of around. So we're hanging it off something in the Beyond the Horizons report, and the thing I want to hang this kind of particular discussion off is the fact that what came back from the report is we found that the vast majority, I think it was 81% of MSPs taking part in the survey, said that they would see growth in their cybersecurity solutions in the next 3 years, with the most in-demand solutions being EDR, MDR, XDR, and things like SOC as a service. How are we seeing this kind of reflected out in our partner base?
It's a good question, Pete. And I'd say it's been a growing trend over the past few years, and technology has evolved. So endpoint security is not a new theme. It's a pretty mature category, but that has evolved. That became EDR as complexity in environments, but also the threats and threat actors got more innovative. Then it extended on to XDR type technologies. And then the requirement for services on top has also grown because it's simply too hard to get the right people, have the right skill set, have the right response times, and so forth. So we're definitely seeing a lot of demand in our base, and we've seen good growth across security. We've recently launched our Enable MDR service to meet some of that demand. And a very important piece of that is the ability to correlate action and then correlate the data, take action, remediate, and so forth. The way I look at it is you need to understand your mean times, right? What's your mean time to detect, investigate, and respond to an event? And that's gotten harder. So now you need better technology. And in most cases, you need people to support you through the process, unless you have the size to accommodate the skill set and the operation it requires to do true 24/7, 365. Most attacks would happen outside of business hours or even in business hours. Threat actors doesn't really care what you work, what your customers work from an hours perspective.
Mm. In fact, it's probably more that even to the extent that they want to be attacking you outside of your kind of, if they can do, they want to be attacking you outside of your traditional working hours, because that I would imagine is when people are seen as being at their weakest, really, which is why having this kind of 24/7 coverage is becoming so critical, isn't it?
Yeah, I'd say yes and no. It depends on the type of attack. If you're
Mm,
doing social engineering and so forth, you'd probably do it in business hours.
mm,
You might time it around vacation. So let's say you compromise a decision maker's credential that has the ability to approve transfers and so forth. You want to do the engineering of that in business hours, and then potentially, if you know when Pete is out on vacation, you want to approve or ask for transfers to happen while that person is out. So it depends on the sophistication and the type of attacks, but I'm sure it's definitely easier certain types of attack to do that outside of business hours because your response time on Christmas Eve or Saturday at 4 a.m. is probably less so than a Tuesday 11 a.m.
mm, mm. And just sort of going back a little bit, you mentioned we talk about EDR. We've got so obviously we've gone from EDR to XDR to MDR. Um, how do you think? And I've seen sort of both sides of this to a certain extent from our partners. Is like, you know, are we getting a bit is it getting a bit, are people getting a bit bored of all these kind of acronyms and these kind of, or not so bored, but confused by these acronyms and the sort of abbreviations that keep coming into the market?
Uh, Yes, I'd say, and it's also some of these spaces are new and they're still being defined, right? So I think
Mm,
EDR is pretty well defined, and it's a known technology, and I'd encourage pretty much any one MSP IT professional to employ some level of EDR technology. If you have cyber insurance, most of them will either demand it, require it, or give you a discount on your premium if you have it. So
mm,
there's really no reason as to not. And looking at the actual cost of it compared to your total IT spend or your total cost sheet as an MSP, it should be a no brainer. Where it gets a little dicey is XDR. You have many types of vendors coming into it. You have your endpoint vendors, you have your edge vendors, you have the data vendors, and everyone's trying to consolidate, right? Because now it becomes like everything demand and response, and you have different claims as to
mm,
what's best and how to get there. Our take as we went into it is we wanted a solution that was really strong in data storage, correlation, aggregation, um, with the ability to do action. So pick enable MDR, right? You have an underlying SIM that's proprietary IP, the same with the SOAR engine that powers it. So you have a really strong software component to it, that allows you to scale and really control where that does and how it does it. And then you're adding the services on top. Um, Most other vendors, right, they would require you to use a specific type of edge device, a
mm,
specific type of endpoint technology. We're agnostic to all because even as an MSP, you might not always control the stack of your customers if you're doing co-managed, or some wants to run with a full Microsoft stack, someone's best of breed, someone is very cost conscious. So you can't necessarily dictate where it is. So that's why we focused on being agnostic, just having a great underlying software platform that can really accommodate most solutions and most layers and kind of like threat vectors. And then you then add a stellar service on top, because that's where most MSPs have a hard time scaling. Because if you run out the staffing that you need to do if you want to do true 24 uh, uh, 24 7 365 is you probably run 8-hour shifts, right? That
mm,
means you need three a day.
mm,
And you have vacations, you have holidays, you have people that sick, you have people that leaves, you have people that needs training and so forth. So it's very hard to get by with less than eight. If you want to do this true, obviously you can have alerts set and so forth, but getting an alert and what happens if you miss that, and on that Saturday morning, and you getting up to speed and being able to really investigate it. Uh, and that just adds to your mean time. Going back to one of the concepts I mentioned earlier, right? It's important that you understand how long it takes for you to do that, and a part of that is the availability, having
mm,
eyes on the screen, kind of eyes on the ball, but also being having the expertise and experience in identifying like what am I dealing with, what am I looking for, and how do I appropriately triage. Because you might be able to get to that conclusion, but if it takes you 2 weeks rather than 20 minutes or an hour, then obviously you're giving a potential threat actor a lot of free reign in your environment.
mm, mm. I know. So kind of sticking with with the sort of MDR theme, I suppose, for a minute, is like, I know that a lot of the focus is at the moment is on MDR as the kind of the current sort of technology, really, and it's is it, I from what I see, it's kind of like, it's very much like this is enabling even smaller MSPs to kind of be able to offer that 24/7 365 support that really, I suppose, the current market and the current environment dictates that they need to have, isn't it?
Yeah, 100%. And let's see, whether big or small. How I
Mm,
look at it is from a do you have the capabilities to build an organization that can accommodate some of the scale we discussed earlier, Pete? So like being able to do like always having eyes on a screen. The other one is, even if you're big enough to accommodate that, what makes most financial sense for you? So you look
mm,
at it. as a business, you have your operating expenses and your capital expenses, and what we saw, and one of the reasons why we leaned into MDR is, uh, if you build out a team yourself, if you build out the services yourself, you're always in one or two states. It's either your team is oversubscribed, right?
Mm.
They have more demand than you have capacity, or they're undersubscribed. That means you have more capacity than you have demand.
Mhm.
And if you have 8 people, hiring another person is a pretty significant increase. If you lose a person, that's a pretty significant decrease in your capacity, but also from a cost perspective.
Mm.
So you're now in a state where either you're uh, burning the cycles and your team too
Mm.
fast, but you're
Mm.
very profitable with the solution, but it's short lived, right? If you want to maintain your team moral, just health in general, or you're not realizing your best possible profits because you've oversubscribed, you hire ahead of the curve.
Mm.
When you work with a vendor to do an MDR type service, you're
Mm.
removing some of that burden because now your cost scales with your business and your business growth, right? If you land a
Mm.
new customer that has 20 users, 200 users, whatever, right? Your cost increases with the number of users you're adding. You don't have to go out and hire a person, or uh, I don't know, potentially oversubscribe your team depending on how you go. And we really saw a big demand there, and we've customers with like tens of thousands of devices subscribing to this, but we also have people with 50, 100, 200 users subscribing to the model because of this, right? And it allows everyone to play and have that enterprise grade team and SOC supporting and backing your operations. So one,
Mm.
you can sleep better, but now you also have a more predictable business, and
Mm.
you're de-risking your business because you don't own the headcount, right? Um, so yeah, or like the software, the contracts, and all those bits and pieces, having to figure that out. So that's
Mm.
definitely a pretty big thing, and one of the trends that we're leaning into, and the market in general, right? Like we're doing this, but we're definitely not the only one
Mm.
building out a security services business.
Mm. Mm. And I suppose also off the back of that, this, I know that I suppose one of the big challenges and with security is kind of selling it down the line, is selling it to customers. And we've got, if you've got this great MDR technology sat in the background doing all this and helping you kind of remediate stuff without without customers, without the end customer even noticing, how do MSPs need to kind of change their mentality, their mindset, to actually communicate the value of these tools that they're taking on board down to their end customers?
Yeah, so it's an interesting question, and I think it's the mindset around security that probably needs to change for most of like the end customers, if you want to call them
Mm.
that, like the small, medium-sized business enterprises, even. And security has been historically perceived as an IT problem, right? It's something that you ask a person to go solve, and then you have no stake in it as a business owner. uh, what has changed or needs to change, if the companies haven't gotten to it yet, is uh, it's a core tenet of having a resilient business, right? It's like you
Mm.
do your insurance, you do your pipeline planning. Like if you're a manufacturing, right, when you have a capacity plan, you've covered. It's like what happens if machinery, your kind of production lines goes out of order. It's the same with security, right? If you don't have that in order, if you don't have access, like if the same as having internet to some extent, right? If you don't have the right level of posture and security, uh, let's say layers in place, you're setting yourselves up for going out of business for potentially an hour, a day, a week, a month, forever.
Mm.
And you as a business owner, right? So this is
Mm.
the, let's call it the end customer in this case, uh, need to have an opinion on it, right?
Mm.
It's not something that Pete, the IT support person or the MSP, will go fix for you. You need to say, I want to invest in security because I want a resilient business that's
Mm.
hedging for uh, cybersecurity the same as you do for a hurricane.
mm,
If you're in a hurricane prone area or whatever, right? It
mm,
becomes a part of driving a business and running it.
mm,
And depending on the type of business you're in, your willingness to protect yourselves against certain attacks should increase, right? Because
mm,
security is, as with anything, right? It's a sliding scale. How much protection are you willing to pay for? There's always more you can add, right? And most people are trying to rationalize the
mm,
costs, right? Because everyone understands dollars, it can be harder to rationalize a security posture. But the way to look at it is how much does it cost for you to go out of business for an hour, for a day, for a
mm,
week, and not
mm,
being able to provide the services, whether you're like a manufacturing plant, your dentist, your lawyer's office, your local grocery shop, whatever type of business you're running, right? Like, what
mm,
does it cost for you to not being able to operate? And that helps you understand your your willingness to pay and the value of not being able to operate. So
mm,
it all comes back to like, hey, uh, I need to drive a resilient business as a business owner. What are the things that I need to put in place? It might be your hurricane measures, right? Your insurance, your
mm,
say staffing capacity, succession planning, but also your cyber insurance, cyber security, posture and stance.
mm, And again, it's interesting. You talk about the sort of the cyber insurance element of it. How much of, I suppose, how much of this is being driven by compliance and by regulation? Certainly from the end user's kind of understanding. Is it something that is it a kind of, I suppose, a push rather than a pull? It's kind of, rather than the MSPs trying to pull them in with talking about how you need to build a resilient business. Is it more about the sort of regulatory bodies and the insurers pushing them towards it?
So I think compliance becomes like you need to be this tall to ride this ride,
Mm,
and so I said that's the bare minimum. And what we're seeing some successful MSPs do is they're trying to be ahead of the curve versus the market going. What are the requirements? But compliance is definitely leaning in on the types of technologies and policies and procedures you need to have in place as an MSP. It depends on and which vertical you play in and support.
mm,
Uh, but what we're also seeing is a lot of MSPs comes after the fact, or when a colleague or like a fellow MSP has been under a compromise, or one of their end customers has been under a compromise, and then suddenly they have a willingness to pay for these services. So again, going back to the like, how much does it cost for you to be out of business, and how much does it
mm,
cost for you to go through incident response, cleaning out the environment, and so forth. And usually the multiples on solving things after the fact is way higher, right? Because it's not cheap to hire cybersecurity professionals to go do incident response, to do the forensics required. So it's usually way more lucrative to invest up front. Even if you might be taking a profitability hit initially, you can usually grow that out and you can upsell the services and align to it. But I put it at is like compliance is a driving factor. That
mm,
becomes an enforcing mechanism, right? If you're not meeting compliance standards and requirements, well, then obviously it's hard to run a business in that vertical. Um, where most people are being successful is being intentional. Okay, what's the minimum bar? What am I comfortable with? And where do I think regulations go? And then doing that ahead of the curve.
mm. And there was, kind of running off that. There was another interesting point. I found it interesting, was that I think, while that came out of the report, is that while SMBs certainly seem to be, there's a growing awareness around the need for cybersecurity, and just generally the threat of, the cyber threat. There's not really, there is a challenge around understanding the actual costs of this, and so even if you are being kind of, even if you are being pushed or pulled or whatever into that market, or into moving deeper into cybersecurity as an end user, there is, I think MSPs are still, are we seeing MSPs still faced with the challenge of getting getting the end users to kind of buy into it and understanding that things, if you want 365, 24/7 365 coverage, this doesn't come for, $100 a month. This is, this is an expensive business.
So, for sure, and people will always try to rationalize costs,
Mm,
and MSP is usually hired for a reason, right? It's to bring in IT expertise. Um, and what we've seen is when you approach it from a cost angle, is now you're giving the person that's hiring you to make educated IT decisions to rationalize the costs
mm,
of a service. So focusing on the problem and the issues with not doing it. So going back to like, hey, how much does it cost for you to go out of business for an hour, a day, a
mm,
week, and so forth, helps them understand the downside of not doing these things, because they won't have an opinion as to whether or not you have a best in breed endpoint security, whether or not you're doing patching in a certain way, you have a best of breed
mm,
backup solution, and so forth. They don't know. That's not what they're great at, right? If you're asking a dentist to make a cost decision on IT services or softwares, uh, that will likely end up in a nickeling and dime situation where they're trying to rationalize cost, because everyone understands a dollar.
mm.
When they've been through a breach, they're usually very willing to pay.
Yeah.
The challenge is of getting them to do that beforehand, and obviously being fair to customers. We're not trying to rob anyone here, but having them understand you're providing a premium, and this is the cost of doing things the right way.
Mm,
Another interesting way of looking at it is people, they're trying to perhaps save $5 or $10 on a per user price, right?
mm,
And if you have them look through their expenses, their amount of money they spend on that per user on IT is probably very limited, regardless of
mm,
the business they're in, right? So it's trying to save 50 cents on your coffee versus getting a better rate on your mortgage, right?
mm, mm, mm,
uh, and and that goes back to like human nature. People are trying understand the dollar, they understand the cost, so they're trying to rationalize that in an area where they have limited expertise. Oh, and having them understand the value or the cost of not doing this the right way is usually puts you in a better position to have them buy into the right solution set, the right level of protection, and not getting into the, well, is it $45 versus $50? Because
mm,
in grand scheme of things, that's probably not what impacts your end customer's business the most, right?
mm,
And that's like the mortgage versus coffee example. Like most MSPs, the services they provide is probably more the equivalent to a cup of coffee or a great meal
mm.
versus the mortgage or the cost of a car to the businesses they serve.
And but this that perspective obviously changes as you go further upstream. I mean, we're talking
Mhm.
about. I mean, I suppose we're talking. I'm that question. I suppose initially for me is targeted at sort of the SMB market. When you move up into the enterprise sector, I think that's a different ball game, isn't it? And I think there are we are well as far as I'm aware, we're seeing increasingly this concept of co-partnering, of co-managing, and MSPs or MSSPs being brought into being brought into enterprises to work alongside their IT to produce these additional kind of like to produce to provide these additional skills. And is that certain things like certainly with our MDR and things like that? Are we seeing that those types of solutions opening the door really to MSPs and MSSPs being able to go in and much more and have those kind of co-managed and co-partnered relationships?
Yeah, I'd say co-managed. Obviously, you're dealing with often a more educated buyer or customer, right? And they're hiring you for a very specific service scope. Obviously, there's an opportunity to expand that scope. Uh, they likely have a greater need for security services, right? They're often in a more vulnerable position to be hit by if they're hit by a security event.
Mm,
I was at Microsoft prior. One of our customers, a big one called Maersk, it's a big shipping company. They
mm,
were out of operations for I think it was about 10 days, and I've seen the estimated cost ranges between 350 to 450 million dollars,
Wow.
right? Just being
Yeah.
out of commission there, right? So obviously
Yeah.
they have greater sensitivity,
Mm.
and it means more to them not to be out of business than perhaps a local grocer if they can't access their cash registry. Okay, that might not be as impactful, right? Because they
Mm.
can circumvent ways. So I say yes, they have a greater need for services. The challenge there is whether or not you can extend your mandate, and then you have an, let's say, a right to play across all
Mm.
services, or you're hired specifically to do patch management or to do application management, backup management, and so forth. But we definitely have some big customers there who are very successful.
Mm.
How I see it is probably more the vertical and industry, like how sensitive you are. Anecdotally, I spoke with a customer who had a client who had refused to buy security services from them. This was a law office.
Mm.
Interestingly enough, they dealt with breach cases. So customers who had been breached and were going through the legal works afterwards, and they had refused these services. They then got
Wow.
breached themselves, and you can obviously guess where that took their business afterwards, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
When they had
there's
to
a
notify.
horrible irony in that one.
Yeah, and that's it. That's probably the bigger thing. Is like one thing is the requirements on which type of software and services you need to run, but more like the requirement to notify
Mm.
customers and publicly notify about a breach is driving even more of this, because that is can be very damaging to your business, as you're going through these notifications. And we're seeing this with enterprises on a daily, weekly basis, right? That's being hit, and that means most MSPs or their customers, SMEs, so forth, probably getting hit, not as publicly as some of these bigger players, but it's
Mm.
happening to everyone. And it's like, hey, what do you do when it happens? And that's where it's really changed over the past probably 10 years. As you went from a if I get breached or if I have an event to when I have an event, what do I do?
Mm. Mm.
And having that right level of preparation. And while there's a great number of very smart security professionals, IT professionals out there, it's whether or not you have the expertise and you have the time allocated to do this in a dedicated fashion. And if you have a 5-man shop, that's harder to do than if you have a 100-man shop, right?
Mm. Mm.
Um, and even if you have the 100-man shop, then you look at the costs, right? Like what does it actually cost to employ this team? And you have the pipeline to have the right amount of talent, right? Because
Mm.
security talent is in high demand. If you hire like a level one analyst, they'll probably stay in that role between a year and a half and 3 years on the high end.
Mm.
They want to then get promoted into like a level two, level three manager, more, I'd say, threat intelligence. Do you have the size of organization that can either upgrade them, up level them, or have the ability to hire new young talent and keep training them and so forth? So that requires your organization to be geared towards that, to have the right level of efficacy and support to your customers, and being able to respond in a timely fashion.
I suppose, and I just was thinking about kind of wrapping up the conversation. Really, what you mentioned there, you mentioned how much things have changed in the past 10 years. I mean, where do you where do you see things going over the next kind of 3 to 5 years? I know there's been talk about AI being, potentially being more deeply embedded in security to help track and resolve breaches. Where do you see things going, and how do you see, I suppose, the product suites developing as well?
Yeah. So I'm definitely still educating myself on AI and what it means, and it feels like
Mm.
everyone is in that position. But nonetheless, like the steps we've taken the past 2 years in advancing that is amazing, right? But it's both good and bad. So it allows you to be way more efficient on a like, hey, how many incidents or how many events can an analyst respond to it and analyze, and how much instant remediation can you do through various machine learning, SOAR workflows, and so forth. Uh, but threat actors are employing the same strategies, right? You had the MGM hack, I believe. That was a person doing a deep fake, calling into the support help desk. They
Mm,
then reset that user and got access to, and that was obviously a pretty big breach. But so you have these type of things. You've seen like phishing has been up leveled because now you can write really elaborate and strong emails.
mm,
Um, and use that for phishing and so forth. So it's become easier to socially engineer to deploy a lot of these tactics. So I'd say, hey, it will allow the good guys, if you will, to be a lot more efficient, to scale, be smarter, be better. Sadly,
mm,
like threat actors are also very smart people, and they're very uh, is that innovative in their enterprises. So they'll deploy these strategies just as well. So that means that the bar to play, right? The height for taking the ride has become much taller,
mm,
and
mm,
you have to invest a lot more to stay ahead of the game, because they now have the means to, like, say, expand their services. And it's actually a market, right? You can't buy like various ransomware, various like threat events as a service now. So that's lowering the bar to get into the game. If you wanted to get into that, definitely not
mm,
encouraging that. But long story short, any technological advances is a good thing for the good guys, for you as an MSP, for you as an IT professional, and so forth, as a software company as well. But it also, on the other side, allows the people we're hoping to obstruct in their enterprises and their exploits, right? Empowering
mm,
them to do more, scale better, and be
mm,
more efficient with how they run their operations. So
mm.
good and bad, and as with anything, right? Any technological advance will be used for both.
And I suppose just wrapping, I suppose my final point being that security is and will continue to be an ongoing investment. It's not a it's not a one and done. It's a kind of it's an ongoing process, an evolution.
For sure, and what we've seen is IT operation and security operations pretty much converge at this point in time. The primary reasons for you doing patching now is to solve vulnerabilities, fixes, and so forth, less about getting the latest functionality, right? And um, the outcome is security, right? You're not buying security, and you're not doing security. You're doing certain things to uh, uh, be more secure, have a more resilient business, and so forth. So definitely ongoing and continues to be more of a thing. But more and more of the IT work that we do, that our customers do, MSPs do, IT professionals do, has a security focus, and it's to try to increase your posture, your level of protection, and so forth, and ultimately to drive more resilient businesses and ensure you can do what you do best, whether it's fixing people's teeth or like
Mm,
exercising law or selling groceries or manufacturing pharmaceuticals and so forth.
mm, mm. Charles, that's been a fascinating conversation. Thank you very much for your time,
No, I
and
appreciate
thank
it.
you for
Thanks for
joining.
having me, Pete.